Good morning, dear colleagues. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Today, as you may know, the board of the Central Bank of Armenia reduced by quarter percentage points the refinancing rate, setting it at 10.5%. We'll ask Mr. Galstyan to present to you the decision, and then you can ask questions. Thank you. Thank you. According to tradition, I will first read out to you the press release and we'll open the floor for Q&A. On its June 13, 2023 meeting, the board of the Central Bank of Armenia decided to reduce the refinancing rate by a quarter of percentage points, setting it at 10.5%. In May 23, the 12-month inflation continued to decrease at a rapid pace. By the end of the month, it was 1.3%. The 12-month core inflation also reduced significantly, reaching 3.1%. In Q2 of 23, the rate of economic growth in the world and our main partner countries had remained slow, and the 12-month inflation continues to decrease. However, in all partner countries, sticky price inflation remains high, and sustained inflationary pressures coming from the labor markets remain high. Therefore, the central banks of partner countries will hereby further conduct a tight monetary policy in the near term. Continued weakening of demand in the wake of tight financial conditions continues to contribute to lower prices in commodity markets. As a result, the inflationary effects of the global economy and Armenia's economy keep on weakening considerably. In Q2 23, a higher than expected economic activity is observed in Armenia, which is driven mostly by strong growth in construction and services. Positive shifts in the labor market and increase in productivity are also leading to certain acceleration of the potential growth rate of the economy. On the other hand, sustained high external demand and increased income in the economy positively contribute to expanding demand. The inflation environment in Armenia continues to mitigate rapidly, owing to the notably weakened inflationary impact from external sector and the implemented contractionary monetary policy and the appreciation of the dram. However, price inflation of services and some goods is adjusting more slowly in the light of high demand and inflation expectations. The board of the Central Bank of Armenia finds it appropriate to reduce the policy rate. The board will be consistent in taking adequate action to handle demand and stabilize inflation expectations. According to the monetary policy charted, under this scenario, the 12-month inflation rate will remain below the target, and in the near future will stabilize around the 4% target in the medium term. The Board of the Central Bank of Armenia estimates that the risk of inflation deviating from the projected trajectory are mostly balanced. In the event that this risk materializes in any direction, the board stands ready to respond accordingly to fulfill the price stability target. Thank you. Arka, please. Arka News Agency. Thank you, Mr. Galstyan. I have two questions with your permission. The Eurasian Development Bank flagged as one of the risks in the Armenian economy the possible exodus of visitors from Armenia, predicting that it may result in reduction 5 to 10% of the GDP. Their estimates of the GDP annually is 4.5%. In this context, does the central bank entertain any scenarios in the context of the migration of those visitors? And what's the central bank's estimates of the annual GDP? And second one, although you partially covered that, what is your estimates about the inflation? For example, by the last IMF forecasts, they estimate the inflation to stabilize at 4% annually, and the Eurasian Development Bank expects 2.5%. What does the central bank think about this? Thank you for the questions. I'll start with the first one. According to our estimates, through the year, the economic growth will be 6.9%. On the right-hand side, you see that over last year we increased by 1% our expectations, mostly in view of the progressive developments in services and construction over our previous estimate period. As for the Eurasian Development Bank's estimates about the international visitors arriving in Armenia, possibly considering living it, with a detrimental impact on the Armenian economy, one should mention here that our estimates, or whatever materials that we have access to, basically polls and surveys, not very reliable. Predicting behavior is not easy. That is hinged on geopolitical, naturally, developments and decisions beyond our control. But the last estimates that I have been exposed to extend to a time horizon. The time horizon that international visitors plan to stay in Armenia has been extended significantly. So most probably they do not expect the Russo-Ukrainian conflict to be resolved anytime soon. As a result, presumably they will be able to return to normal lives in their native countries. So the number of respondents who have expressed the willingness or inclination to stay longer has increased. As for our estimates of the annual inflation, it will be somewhat lower than the target. The target is set at 4%. We estimate that the inflation will be below that. In the course of the most recent developments, we have observed a phenomenon. Imported food product prices are plummeting more rapidly than what we predicted initially. That's the green line, but then there is also the significant share of unregulated services which stays on a higher level than the target of our inflation. Civic, please. Mr. Galstyan, I would like to clarify. Days ago, the Russian Kommersant published information about the Armenian banks starting to block payments for legal persons from the Russian Federation for electronics. The integrated circuits, microprocessors and the like are involved, whether this information is reliable or not. And the second part pertains to deposits by citizens of Armenia. What's the dynamics there? Are they on the rise, or if you have numbers, could you please quote them? In general terms, in our relations with commercial banks, we do not guide them towards any action. Our regulatory documents and our regulation nudges the banks to work in compliance with the best international practices, that is KYC, properly gauge the risk appetite and naturally be able to appropriately implement the functions that are characteristic of the banking system. If you may recall, last year there was the different discourse that the Armenian banks are hyperactive in attracting customers, whether it will result in substantial risks emerging. And back then, our discourse with our colleagues in the banking system and our call to them was hinged on the thesis that it's up to them to manage their own risks. So whatever action that is aiming at managing risk may result in severing relations with certain counterparts, or relations with certain counterparts resulting in wire transfers not being implemented. That may not only be determined by the individual decisions of the Armenian banks, but also their corresponding banks, because if a wire transfer is wired through a foreign bank, there is a conditionality that the Armenian bank must comply with. As a result, certain partnership relations with clients may be severed, transformed, increased, reduced, depending on the circumstances. Perhaps it may be related to the sanctions. There may be cases when this is explained by the sanctions. There may be other cases that are not related with the sanctions. It's just that the counterpart may not be able to submit the entire scope of documentation that the bank needs for full-fledged cooperation therewith. As for non-resident deposits, according to the data that we have, the balance as of 31 May 23 was 706 billion Armenian drams, which is represents over the previous year same period double that. But in the most recent period, we may acknowledge that the growth rates are milder than what we had throughout last year as a result of the developments. Sputnik. Thank you, Mr. Galstyan. If we look at the inflation at various categories of goods, we'll see that what you mentioned, that the non-regulated services prices are gradually declining since early this year. So can we acknowledge that the demand-driven inflation was successfully constrained, and this target may be deemed accomplished, give or take, at this point in time. As for food prices, in May it went below zero, so there was a decline in prices. To what extent is this associated, perhaps in percentage terms, with the fluctuation of the exchange rate? And to what extent is it determined by the falling food prices? Because the FAO index also tracks reduction except for one or two types of food. And what's the share of the falling demand, if that applies? applies to foodstuff. Thank you for the question. I'll start with the non-regulated service prices. Yes, there is a certain decline there, but I believe that the main cornerstone incentive or contributor to today's decision of the Board of the Central Bank of Armenia was the following. If you remember a few meetings before this, we were talking about a possible scenario, and since we're now guided in our monetary policy by risk management, back then we discussed a scenario about a spiraling development in the labor market, wage price spiral, that is. So we were exercising certain restraint. Even when the inflation started to go down, we left our rate unchanged within the last two iterations. The most recent data comes to prove that those risks have substantially reduced. We observe that if we look at it from the business perspective, out of the two main expenses, the inputs, food and other, as well as wages, along these two lines we have certain positive development which allowed the central bank to exercise certain optimism about the success that we accomplished through our policy to reduce the interest rate. We see that alongside the decline, there is still demand-driven high inflation along certain services. If you look at this chart, the gray line comes to prove that there are services whose inflation is still higher than above our 4% level. So our activities, I think, our actions, interventions were quite balanced, and this determined the central bank's decision to reduce by a quarter of a percentage point. Another question: is this contributing to overheating of the labor market, and to what extent does this continue to be affected by the booming construction, which ensures employment and increase in wages? If you look at the annual nominal wage increase, it's hovering around 20%. It's quite significant. But within the last months, we have observed a slowdown of the growth rates. Therefore, there are certain positive shifts in the labor market as well, which was, among others, one of the light motives of our decision. Mr. Galstyan, you mentioned that the inflation will stay around it will be lower than 4%. Does this assume that the refinancing rate will keep on going down? What are the prospects and what will be its impact? Will the borrowing costs go down? And the second question, in the projection about the GDP, I noticed that there is a reduced industry growth rate over the last indicator. And the third question, deposits, non-resident deposits reduction. The last time I checked, it was March, and if we compare it with earlier this year, there was a 1% decline, about 300 billion dram, if I'm not mistaken. 1% of a decline, that is. So could you tell us what caused this? The fact that there is the reduction in the growth rate or absolute reduction, that's uncontestable. What determines it is the question. Let me start with the interest rate. If I understood you correctly, what's the future trend in the interest rate dynamics? I would like us here to pay attention to the finer points rather than just the number representing the inflation. If you look at the green curve, there is a steep downfall in imported products. And if had we been guided only by this component, which is a supply side component, we should have drastically reduced the interest rate, because the inflation goes down faster than what we expected. That's just part of the story. But like I already mentioned, we have demand-driven certain inflationary developments in the economy, which in our opinion should be our main focus in the months to come, managing this demand. That is, if we succeed there, then naturally the reduced interest rate will follow. We will be more comfortable about not encountering in the future a situation where we reduce the interest rate and face sometime down the road a situation when the base effects of imported foodstuff is no longer there, only the demand factor remains, which is high, and we still exceed our target. Our mindset is as follows. After having high inflation for 2 years in succession, the disinflationary policy that we will carry on through this year should help us to anchor inflationary expectations. As you may see, our most recent surveys and polls in Q3 of 23 over Q1, essentially the weight of people with low inflationary expectations has even gone down. 40% were cherishing low inflationary expectations in Q1. In Q3, it's down to 30%. This 10% was added to the uncertainty group. So, also determined by behavioral aspects, our decisions will be guided. As for non-resident deposits in foreign currency, there are several phenomena here, or maybe perhaps they may have found a more comfortable jurisdiction to keep their savings. You know that currently in the world, foreign currency deposits attract higher rates, so people prefer to keep their deposits in US dollars in the USA if they can afford to. But since the change is not significant, essentially it's 1%, it would be hard to say what is the driving force behind this. One such impact could be the increased rates on deposits elsewhere, which contributed to the shift. As for our estimates, nothing is significant changed in the industry. From 4.8 it went down to 4.7 or 6, which essentially is determined by current developments, so that is not a pessimistic estimate of the future. 4.6% of growth in the industry is quite high in the annual perspective, and we believe that it will have a healthy impact and contribute to the overall economic growth. Mr. Galstyan, you mentioned, did I get you right when you said 706 billion total non-resident deposits, or was it the growth? That's non-resident natural persons deposits total. Non-resident total is 1,132 billion. And the idea that the colleague has voiced, as of early March, there was 1% decline over last year, over beginning of last year. Did this trend persevere? According to our observations, if I look annually, the total, which also includes the deposits by legal persons, has decreased. But when it comes to natural persons, we have 0.5% increase, growth. This is at fixed rate to eliminate the impact of the noise of the exchange rate fluctuations. Since beginning of year, 31 May compared to December 31. About the IMF standby review they published today. The IMF advises the government the following: if more than expected budgetary revenue materializes, they advise not to spend it but to keep it in fiscal buffers. Do you estimate that the executive will do as advised and that will not lead to increased demand in the economy? Will there be budgetary austerity in place? According to our estimates, for 2023, the fiscal signal would be 1% contractionary. All of the calls from international partners or the academia about saving buffers in good times are fully justified. We do the same for the banking sector. You may know that this year we increased the counter-cyclical buffer for the commercial banks by significantly, which assumes that the part of the returns the banking sector got last year should augment the capital. This is one of the tools that we used to try to come up with a certain layer of lard, which naturally will be demanded in the reverse economic cycle. I believe our colleagues in the government have a very good grasp on this as well, and the behavior that they had last year, not to succumb to temptation and not to increase current expenditures significantly, will be reasonably maintained. The budget expenditures increase last year was mostly on the expense of capex, and our estimate is, and we see that the increase in capex has also significantly contributed to the potential growth of the GDP, which had a positive impact as well on the closing the GDP gap down the road. The demand is high now, and we should do everything for our GDP potential to increase, for the gap to be not as a result of the fall in demand, but to cross paths at a certain point. To some extent the demand goes down, and to some extent the economic potential goes up. They cross paths on the higher level. Mr. Galstyan, it's common knowledge, whoever follows economic developments, that Armenia's exports to Russia are mostly re-exports. We have analysis about that by groups of commodities. Yesterday it was mentioned that out of 187% of growth, only 47 percentage points are on the expense of domestic productions. The rest is re-exports. 2 Armenian companies have already been subjected to sanctions. I would like your opinion. What's the extent to which we are approaching the dangerous threshold of this list growing and firing back on the Armenian economy? I cannot tell you with respect to economic agents as to what behavior they adopt. My estimate is that over the year we will see a certain decline in total both imports and exports over the last year's peaks. I believe that this phenomenon is just a link in the chain of certain responses by our international partners. There are companies in partner countries which, whenever they sell goods to you, claim assurances that there will be retailed in your own jurisdiction rather than re-exported. The more the weight of such transactions or conditionalities increase, the more we will see the re-exporting operations reducing in volume. So my estimate is throughout this year we will have both imports and re-export certain decline. As for sanctions, from the I can only answer from the financial sector perspective. I'm not so aware of the real sector. We are working with the banking and financial sector, our colleagues that is, in order to keep them safe from potential sanction risks. There are cases and companies that had maintained accounts in the banking system and carried out certain such operations, but that was singular and not mass scale. So I believe that as a result of appropriate management of their risks and with some help from the central bank that is sharing materials and advice, we will eventually arrive in a situation where Armenia will be safe from those potential risks and they will not have an impact on the Armenian financial market and economic developments. So far, in conditions of these re-exports, were there any issues with financial flows? Was there anything that worried central bank? There were several individual cases which we discussed with our international partners. As a result, measures were taken, but they are infinitesimally small scale and isolated. No issue of systemic nature that requires central bank being concerned in the past or now do not exist. Civilinet. Mr. Galstyan, you mentioned the importance of capex from the perspective of economic growth. We chronically under-deliver capital expenses. What is the government considering, or what positive trends do you see, if at all? Our sources in the government and our observations indicate that this chronic under-delivery of expenditures, so the projected capex are not implemented fully. Our opinion on the budget, which we submitted to the National Assembly on 22, budget performance indicators, there are some under deliveries, but less than last year, because the total capex increased, and concurrently with that, the performance indicators, the implementation rates have also increased. Of course, there's no end to perfection, and you have always to strive to do it in the best possible manner, but over the course of the last year, we have observed this substantial positive shift. And the follow-up question pertains to the transactions with the Armenian banks. This Commerzant article that was referred to, blocking these transactions pertains to purchases from Russia that are channeled through the banking sector, or they also pertain to businesses registered in Armenia with roots extending back to Russia, or Armenian incorporated entities with Russian capital. Frankly speaking, over the last 2 days we were preoccupied with the interest rate. Maybe that's why I must have missed this publication in Commerzant. I will definitely consult it, but let's agree I will speak generally because I haven't looked at what you're referring to in detail. Our banking system is doing its best to manage its own risks. Whether a person is resident or not, what is the scope of goods, imports, exports is part of it. But we're not talking discrimination here. We're talking about the banking system trying within reason to manage those risks that may arise with this or that transfer or maintaining a particular account. So the advice of the central bank has been unchanged over years. The central bank started to pay more focused attention to all these in the light of the most recent developments. And we have pleaded with our colleagues in the banking sector to pay enhanced attention to compliance and transactions like this. Great caution has to be exercised in these matters, and persistency, whether in attracting staff, educating staff, certification of staff. There are clear requirements that we have imposed, and they are going to be increasingly more stringent. The most recent trends will increase, get deeper, and it's very important for us, for the capacity that exists in the banking sector, to be the best or near perfect. About exporting sectors, can we acknowledge that since mid last year the concern that was raised about appreciation of drum resulting in systemic fallout, flight of workforce, especially software engineers. Can we claim that those risks, at least for now, have not materialized, and those sectors continue to generate product? And their contribution to the gross output and demand for wages has not changed essentially. I believe by the end of the day you're right. There are quite natural sectors and companies that will have issues in view of the appreciation of drum affecting their competitive position. But there are other factors as well. In the United States, the IT is on the decline, and that is not determined by the strength of the dollar but by the Fed interest policy and the slowdown in the economy. As for Armenia, globally I believe your assessment is accurate. Last year we have 12.6% economic growth. Part of it was accounted for by exporting industries. Over this year the appreciation of drum was quite moderate, I believe. As for the future of those companies, the government has implemented certain support measures, and that's a continual process. I believe that through this year as well, those companies will not yet encounter the most grave issues that their partners encounter in foreign countries. Hopefully they will not come up against that. And our policy is so that we started to reduce the interest today. That instrument will also mitigate certain pressures for those companies, on those companies, as in the overall economy. Mr. Galstyan, you referred to the Fed. I remember the American. It reminded me of the American financial sector because several banks encountered serious challenges most recently. In the European space, there were also several banks encountering difficulties. We tried to gain understanding whether we're facing another international financial crisis. Are we on the eve of another one? And will this have long-range consequences globally, including on Armenia? Are you tracking these developments, and what can you say about that? Is this a dangerous trend, or are they local issues that are being addressed? The SVB, there were several also crypto bank issues. The available data comes to indicate that these are at least regional developments, not global, not characterizing the overall US financial market. If we look at the most recent consensual predictions, they concur about the following. The predominant majority of the market players say that in this next meeting on Thursday, the Federal Reserve will keep the rate stable. Some participants believe that this is explained by the concerns that further increase in the interest rate may raise another wave of problems in financial institutions. We'll see what they do with the interest rate. I don't have first-hand information. I get my updates from the media and international press, but all of these comes to converge on claiming that it's not very likely that we're facing yet another global financial crisis in the near future. Maybe the economy embarks on a recession cycle. The Fed may or may not succeed in softening the fall trade policy, but we cannot with any likelihood claim or talk about financial crisis. The answer is no. Can we expect, and this is more monetary block, can we consider this as an impact of a certain outflow of foreign investors in Armenia, provided these rates are quite close or approximation and thereof between USA and Armenia takes place. It grows in the States, it doesn't in here, so investors may prefer to shift their investments to developed countries such as the USA. Thank you for... Well, the question basically boiled down to the risk premium. How attractive Armenian Eurobonds are compared to US T-bills. At this point in time, there's 300 to 400 base points the spread. As a result of the policy of reducing the interest rates, this will be about Armenian T-bills and Armenian corporate bonds denominated in Armenian drams. There is a different phenomenon observed here. Within the last months, we see that certain international reputable financial institutions have decided to invest in Armenian dram-denominated T-bills, treasury bills. The expectation, I may assume, is that the Armenian government and central bank are implementing high-quality macroeconomic policies, and presumably, in the opinion of the investors, the central bank maintained monetary policy will yield its results. The central bank will be able to contain inflation, and it will reduce the interest rate. As a result, the T-bill prices will go up. So within the last several months they have entered the Armenian T-bills market, and I assume this was determined by what I just outlined. Follow-up question. The Minister of Finance recently mentioned that also determined by this fact they want to update their sovereign debt policy and look at how expedient it would be to increase the share of the national currency denominated in the total sovereign debt. What's the position of the central bank in this? Offhand, it will be difficult for me to express any opinion. The document that you refer to from the Ministry of Finance, I have yet to see if it exists. Once we lay our hands on such a document, we will strike agreements with our colleagues from the Ministry of Finance. As a result of those meetings, we will, of course, naturally express our position on this or that development. Surveys among Russian citizens were quoted by you. Which period did they cover? They basically stated, if I'm not mistaken, that they either kept unchanged or increased their horizon of expecting to stay put in Armenia. If I'm not mistaken, that was a survey in Q1 23. The one preceding it was last year. The dynamic is as follows. Those who plan to stay or wish to stay more than 6 months in Armenia increased in weight. That is, individuals who were intending to stay 6 or more months have an increased share in the total of respondents. Another clarification about non-resident deposits. Can there theoretically be a factor which determines the decrease of those demands by technicalities, that is, the non-residents become residents? That's a statistical adjustment. That is how our banks classify onboarded clients, and what information is shared with the Statistics Department of the Central Bank. That consolidates. On our next meeting, we may be able to report whether there was any significant shift there. Thank you. If there are no further questions, we'll conclude this meeting. Thank you.